Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. Our webinar today is Water Cooler Talks, a look into a developer's workbench. Our goal today is to just have a chat about some of the tools and processes that developers use and share some ideas and learn from each other. So trying to kind of keep this somewhat interactive. Anyway, we're going to give it about another minute just for people to log in, and then we will get started. So we'll talk to you in about a minute. For those just joining, your audio is just fine. We're waiting for another minute or so for people to join, and then we'll get started. All right, Howard, why don't you start the screen share?
Okay, Graham, we're all set. We're showing the agenda slide right now.
Okay, then I'm not seeing it.
Well, oh, okay. I apologize. I must not have clicked the appropriate button. Hold on one second. Let me make myself presenter. And I skipped that one step. Okay.
There's that momentary panic where it's like, is it my fault? Nope, nope.
No.
Okay, now we see everything. Thanks very
Silly
much.
me.
So, all good. So again, thank you for joining everyone today, and welcome to this month's OpenNTF webinar. So I'll be your master of ceremonies today. Our presenters are OpenNTF board members Howard Greenberg, Jesse Gallagher, and Serdar Bechamez, and then we'll do some questions at the end. Next slide. As far as questions go, you can use the panel in the GoToMeeting or use the widget in the GoToMeeting panel and go ahead and put your question in. And the answer to the very first question that we always get on every webinar is, will this be recorded? The answer is yes. And we will be posting the result on YouTube. There is a questions widget in the panel. Feel free to go in there and type in your questions. We're going to hold all the questions until the end of the webinar so that we can actually speak to them, because the audio or the video recording doesn't catch the GoToWebinar panel. So we'll speak to all the questions at the end. And obviously keep the questions related to the topics that the speakers are discussing. Those are the ones that we'll focus on anyway. Unrelated questions, you're certainly welcome to go to our Slack channel. For those that aren't aware, openntf.slack.com is actually really quite active. And people are watching that, and we'll be happy to answer your questions there if they're not related to the webinar. Let's go ahead. So quickly, we will thank our sponsors. HCL has made a contribution to keep OpenNTF operating, and they fund things like these webinars and contests and hackathons and the overall running of the organization. So we'd like to say thank you to HCL. And we'd also like to say thank you to Prominic, which donates all of our IT related services for hosting and various different infrastructure servers and what have you. And they also do the system administration. I'd also like to take a quick moment while we're watching this slide to recognize a member of our Lotus collaboration community that we lost this past Saturday. Andrea Fontana lived in Italy, close to Milan, and was involved in a motorcycle accident. He was a longtime contributor to our community, a member of OpenNTF as well, and was an IBM champion and spoke at many events. His friends and fellow Yellowsphere members, Roberto and Matteo, have shared heartfelt stories on Andrea on their blogs and social media, and they give a wonderful picture of the kind of person that Andrea was. Members of the OpenNTF board and all of us in the Lotus community want to pass along our condolences to his family and friends. He will be missed. Okay, Howard, we can go to the next slide. So talking about OpenNTF, you know, this is our community, right? We all like to help and contribute, and I would just like to ask that if anybody is interested, please join us, get involved. If you have a question even about something, by all means, speak up, and we can help solve the problem and then share it with the larger community. We're all volunteers, and as I say, no effort is too small, so even if it's just a simple question, that works well. But if you do have an idea and you want to work on a project or think that there would be something that would be of value to the community that's maybe bigger than yourself, bring it up, and you know, we're connected. We can bring a team together of people that are interested and make it happen. So please do speak up. And even if you want to help out but aren't necessarily you know, up to speed on the particular code that you're thinking about, or an admin function or something else, a script, by all means, you can test or help modify an existing project, writing documentation, or even adding reviews. That's another way to contribute too. So we invite everyone on the webinar today to get involved. All right, Howard, over to you, sir.
Well, thanks, Graham, and appreciate the intro. And also want to mention out in terms of helping out, hey, if you got something to share with the community and want to do one of these webinars, this is something we're going to try to do monthly. We already got a speaker for September lined up, and I'm pretty sure I got a speaker for October lined up. But let us know. And if it's something you either want to pull together, or if it's a presentation you might have done at a user group previously, or we're planning on doing at a user group this year, but times have changed, just let us know. We'll look over what you want to talk about and find a time slot for you, and would love to have some speakers for our webinar series. So I am a consultant. I've been around for quite a while, been involved with TLCC for over 20 years. And TLCC has been involved in developing training material for Notes and Domino for admins and developers and users. But the last quite a few years, I've been mostly involved in developing and primarily do Domino, XPages apps. Lately, it seems like I've been mostly working on extending Domino and Notes apps via APIs and creating a JSON-based API so people could use the data in other places. And occasionally I even go into some very old Notes client apps and try to get those to working or have a new function or change something. So primarily I'm in Domino Designer pretty much almost all the time as my primary app editor. But more and more lately, I've been trying to, wherever I can, work with my clients using source control apps. And the source control apps are primarily BitBucket, which is the repository where we're going to store everything, and SourceTree, because I don't want to learn a new command line and I don't use it, you know, a lot of the functionality that BitBucket and Git, I'll explain what that is in a minute, provides. So SourceTree provides a nice a UI, user interface, to manage the process. And then there's just a little a plugin that we use in Domino Designer called Swiper. And I say this makes it bearable because what that does is filter out some of the changes Domino Designer makes to design elements that you really weren't changed, what we would call the metadata. So you don't want those being shown as changes when you're doing source control, because obviously those changes are not really critical to what we're trying to accomplish. So the key to this is BitBucket. And this actually is sort of optional, but then you lose that on a lot of the benefits. So what BitBucket is a cloud-based place to store your code. And it uses something called Git. Git is the software that actually does the version controlling. And the nice thing about it is that BitBucket is free for up to 5 users. You can have up to 5 users on a private repository. And that also includes some issue tracking software that integrates in so that you can use free as well, which is nice if you have a small developer shop and you want to track issues, or even a single developer shop that's working with maybe your customers' or end users, and you want to just track, issues, problems, or feature enhancements. If you do go more than 5 users, you're not going to go broke. It's only $3 per user per month. So they also have, when I say cloud, obviously people worry about security. You can have repositories that are private, and then you control the users who are allowed access to that. Or if it's something you want to share, like many of the OpenNTF projects, or you're presenting at a user group or somewhere else online, like today, you can have a public repository where you put your NSF and related files up in the cloud, and people can access just with the URL. So your source code is stored in the cloud. That's kind of good, because now it's safe from your hard drive crashing, from ransomware. Plus, we're tracking all the versions, so you can always go back and see what changed, who changed it, and what exactly what changed in that. You can go back to those previous versions. You can also, if you want to get a little more advanced, you can branch, and you can have a master branch, which maybe is your production level code, but then you can branch over and have a development branch where you add some enhancements, test it. When you're ready to go, you then merge that into your master branch. You can do bug fixes the same way, spin off a branch, fix a bug. When you know it's going to work, merge it back into your master branch. And again, if you need to roll back, you can roll it back pretty easy. If for some reason you do not want to use a cloud-based service for security reasons, your company reasons, you can also set up your own BitBucket server. And this whole BitBucket part is optional. If you want to just keep everything local on your hard disk, you still can do the version control and the branching and that sort of stuff, just using Git on your local machine, which comes with SourceTree, which is the next thing I'll mention. And as I said before, SourceTree is simply a user interface that sits on top of Git. When you install SourceTree on your local machine, it will install Git, which is the actual version control software. And you can, if you want to go in and learn the command lines, you can, but SourceTree provides that interface, and it's all free, which is nice. What are the advantages of using this process versus just staying in Domino Designer? If you just stay in Domino Designer, there is no way to roll back to other versions. You have to basically make a snapshot of your NSF stored somewhere. Lots of times we would make a copy and put the date on it, and then we know we can go back. But then there's no way to really tell what exactly changed from one version to another. So you don't really have that capability. Yes, you can roll back to a certain date that you might have saved, but it's then you're going to lose all your other stuff. So it's really nice having that version control. Safe code storage. Your code is always going to be stored. Your server could crash in Domino. Your hard drive can crash on your Notes client. You could lose your code. I'm sure that's never happened to any of us. But with the advantage of this is that once you commit your change and push it up to BitBucket, it's up in the cloud, it's safe, and you can always fall back and rebuild a new machine with that. As I mentioned too, the branching, which is real good, especially when you get your code out there in production, to be able to then say, okay, now I want to go add some new features, or I want to do some bug fixes, go through that development process, go through the testing process, and then merge it into your main production line of code. One thing that just to, if this is not necessarily a team development, of course it works with teams, but if you both edit the same form or XPage or Java code, it's not going to figure out how to merge that one design element. But as long as teams are working on different parts, you can, that's not a problem. I could change one form, Graham could change some Java code, and then it'll just, when we put your changes up there, it'll just merge all those in terms of the individual files. But it won't actually figure out your conflicts if you edit the same file, whatever that file might be. And by file, I mean the individual design elements. So the way this works, and it's important to kind of understand that in Domino Designer, we have our NSF file that we're making changes to that same way we've always done. And that's in the notes data directory typically. But then when we use source control, when we create this in Domino Designer, we're going to go ahead and create another Eclipse project that's called the OnDisk project, or ODP, you might see used. And that ODP, that OnDisk project, is what we're going to be monitoring with Git to figure out what changed and handle the version control. So what we're going to do is have a separate directory on our disk outside of our notes data directory that holds the project. Okay, so so that's important to know, that we're then going to keep the NSF and the OnDisk project synced. And you can choose in Domino Designer in the preferences to have the syncing happen automatically, or you could choose to do it manually, where you right click on the NSF and say, sync with my OnDisk project. Sometimes in a real big NSF, and it might be a little quicker. I've noticed some performance issues when it syncs automatically every time you make a change, and it starts syncing, and it takes a while. But most of the NSFs I've seen it's pretty seamless. You don't know that it's syncing. It happens pretty quick. So the changes, so we're talking about, obviously, and typically we're going to change things in Domino Designer, which will be in the NSF. That's going to go to the OnDisk project. So two terms that we need to understand. Once we make a change, it'll show up in SourceTree. And then if we like that change, we can what's called commit it. And so committing is when we're actually going to say, okay, this is, if you want to call it a version, or this is something we're going to record as a set of changes. So that's what we're going to do, is commit those changes. And then at the same time, or later on, we could push those changes up to the BitBucket cloud or the BitBucket server if we're using that. So these changes can go from the NSF to the OnDisk project, but also if we're in a multi-person or multi-developer environment, or even if you're just one developer with multiple machines, you can pull changes down from BitBucket down to the local storage to your OnDisk project, and then they'll sync to the NSF. So the changes go both ways. So once we're, obviously we're going to make our design changes. Typically, I always work locally, if I can, not on a server copy. And that's what you want to use with the syncing and everything. You typically are going to want a local NSF to sync, but then I'll have a server-based replica that I use for testing. And once we know that the changes are good, then I can, use the template process and move that to a different NSF to roll out for either production or user testing, or something that we might want to have accessed on a bigger scale. One thing it's important to remember, we're only talking about design elements that are getting synced. Even if you have data in the NSF, it's not going to go up to BitBucket or get version control or anything. So we're only talking about the design elements. Okay, and I mentioned before the Swiper project. So that's a little OpenNTF project. And as I said before, that kind of gets rid of the little changes that Domino Designer likes to make to a bunch of files when you change one file, but you didn't touch the other ones, but somehow it thinks they're changed. And you'll see those in the source control. Those will typically have a .metadata extension to them. And since sometimes those are changes that you might need, but lots of times they're just changes that to a date or a version or something like that, that you don't necessarily want to, clutter up your source control. So to add the swiper, once you install it, then you can right click on the database you want to add it to and just say add swiper. And the link to get that is on the slides. The other tip I want to share is Domino Designer has two ways. What it's doing is taking your design elements and creating a file called DXL. And you don't want, there's two ways to do this DXL file. If you look at the graphic on the screen, you could use binary DXL, which is self-explanatory. It's all your files will be binary format, which is not very helpful when you try to figure out what changed. So you want to turn that off, and that way there'll be text-based files. So your form, when you view it with just a text editor, it'll just be a bunch of text, and you can actually kind of see what the changes were. It's a little more obvious for code-based things like Lotus Script, Java, XPages, in terms of making sense. But all the design elements get converted to a text-based DXL if you turn off this option, and that's in your Domino Designer properties. Here's where also you can turn on the automatic syncing that I was talking about. So you can enable that or disable that in your preferences. So let's see. Let me take just real quick, do a real quick demo of setting up a project in Source Control. So the first place that I start in, if I'm going to convert an NSF to use Source Control, is I'm going to go to my BitBucket account. And again, this is all free. You can go set that up. It's Atlassian is the company that owns this. And so you can go there, get an Atlassian account, and then you're all set. You'll be able to go to BitBucket. So I'll go on the left side. I'll create a new repository. Repository is where we're going to store our code. And by the way, you could have multiple NSFs in one repository. You'll see how that's done in a second. But okay, I'm going to assign this to a project called the Webinar One, and I'll call it OpenNTF Webinar. And here's where I can make it private or public. If I make it private, then I can go in and select users who can access this, and I can control their settings as well. Also, it asked me about a README file. This is really a great way to document your project. So if you say include a README file, it'll create it. You can have a tutorial for beginners, and then you can have or just a template. I usually just choose a template. And this is edited, the README file is edited with a markdown language that you can use just in a text editor. So I'll create this repository. And then when I'm all done, I'll go, right now you see that it created a README file. This is actually the README file shows when you access the repository on the web. So this is my README file that it created a little template. And so we can actually edit that file on our local machine, or you can even edit it up on the BitBucket website. I think it's right here. No, I think I gotta click here. And I can come in and edit the repository. But for now, let's not do anything with that. I'm just going to click clone, and it's going to give me a URL. So I'm going to copy that URL to my clipboard. And now at this point, I'm going to switch over to SourceTree, and I'm going to go to File, Clone New, and I'm going to paste in that URL. So here's the URL, and it has git clone. It's going to clone it, and then I'm going to pick a path on my local system. So I have a directory structure under data git. I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call it webinar. And I'll select that, and I'll click clone. And that will create my project on my local machine. And you'll look, if I click on master on the left side, it has initial commit, and the only file it put up my README file here. That was part of that. So let's look. Let me just show you what it actually did on the local machine, just so you have an understanding of that. So if I go to my webinar folder, it created the copy down the README file. So if I change this on my local machine, it will start tracking those changes. Then it has a .git directory, which has all the housekeeping files, storing the version control and all the changes. I'm going to create a new folder here that's going to hold all the information in our NSF, all the design elements and everything. So I'm going to call this, I'll call it NSF. And I'm just going to keep that empty for now. Okay, now I can go back to Domino Designer. And let me switch to my working set. Okay, so I have a NSF here that has XPages, forms, views, all the good stuff that make up a design. And this is stored in my notes data directory. And so at this point, I'm just going to right click and I'm going to go to team development, set up source control. I'm going to click next here. Don't need that. I'm going to give it a name. I'll call it OpenNTF Webinar ODP, just so I know this is my ODP. And I'm going to check off use default location because I want to pick the location I just created. That was under data, Git, webinar, NSF. So I want that NSF folder. You don't want to put your NSF contents in the root of the source control because then you can't have other files and the README. It's going to mess up, like the README will kind of mess it up because it won't really know how to move that in and out of from the ODP to the NSF. So I always create a separate folder for just the design elements that are going to sync back and forth in Domino Designer. And then you have the root, the webinar folder will be like the parent, and I can have other files in there. So you're not limited to just tracking, Domino Designer NSFs. You can do any sort of files you want, code files or other JavaScript files or HTML or anything else that's part of this project. Okay, I'll say finish. And it's going to go export all my stuff that I had in the NSF. It created, if you go under, now you don't see this under your normal view on the left side in the applications navigator from Domino Designer, but if you click on Navigator or Package Explorer, you'll see that it created this new Eclipse project. And it says associated with Open Web NSF. So now if we go back and look at my folder, so here's my folders. I have my NSF folder, and now notice that it has populated this. It has my views, it has, XPages, all that stuff you see has been converted to files. So like forms, we got a form folder, and it puts .form as an extension. Okay, the next thing I want to do is go back to my application, and I want to add in a swiper. So I know that I got that, do it right away. And now we can start developing. So let's say I go and, actually, before I do that, let me go back to SourceTree. Once you go ahead and set it up, now you notice that a whole bunch of files were listed as being changed because I added all these files to our source control. Let me make sure I got them all. I'm just going to go to team development and I'm going to sync just to make sure I get everything. So I'll go back to SourceTree. Now I'm going to just go to file status, say stage all. So I'm going to stage all those files, the initial load of my design up to Git, and I'm going to commit it. So I have 17 files I've got to be committed. It seems like that's not enough. I don't know why I'm missing some, but I'm going to stage all those, and I'm just going to say initial load. Now, so if I can click the commit button, that will commit it, and then I can use the push button to push it, but I can also click this button here and do both steps at the same time. Okay, now it's asking me to log in. Let's see, what was my login? Of course, it remembers all this until you have the day of the webinar. Okay. Of course, I don't have my password. So anyway, I committed that, so that's fine. My push didn't work, so I can't push it up. I'll have to figure out my password. So now we have, oops, I lost my project. Let me open that again. Okay, so here's my changes. Okay, I guess it never happened. Let me just commit it, not push it. File status. Okay, so there I committed that. I haven't pushed it up yet. I'm not going to do that because I don't know my password. I know it, but I don't want to take time guessing at it. So there's my initial load. So now if I go back to Domino Designer and I create something, let's say an XPage, and call it test, and put something in it, and save it. And now I can, I think I have sync turned on automatically, just in case I'll sync it. And go back to SourceTree, and under file status, it should have my change. Let me sync that again. And I guess not. Oh, okay, I lost my project. I'm in a different project. For some reason, my version of SourceTree, I upgraded to the newest version, and it's been closing this new project for some reason. Okay, so there, now that I got the right project, so here's my new XPage. It's not staged yet, so I'll just say stage all. And we'll just say a new XPage and commit it. So now if I click on master here, you see that we have our initial load, which was all a whole bunch of files, and then the new XPage. And here's a new XPage. And as I said before, these are just text-based files. So you can see the change. And this was a new file, so it's not really, you know, everything's in green saying that's the change. If you had some deletions, it would be in red. So that's kind of it as far as I want to go right now. So again, there's a lot of functionality you can do in terms of branching and stuff like that. And there's a lot of information you can find on the web about SourceTree and Git. And it's kind of good to understand some of the terminology, the commit, pull, push, branching, some of that stuff. But you don't have to be an expert. And using SourceTree makes that a lot of that stuff kind of hidden. Okay, and so Jesse, I think we're going to turn it over to you.
Okay, first off, before I begin, thank you very much for going over all that source control stuff as well. I'm actually in the middle of writing a blog post, and now I have a new webinar to reference after this recording is done. So thank you very much. But on to my part. So I am Jesse Gallagher. I am been a Domino XPages developer for a good while now. I am on Twitter as @Gidgerby, and you can read my blog at frostilic.us. So there I tend to blog about the projects I've been working on and a lot of the things that I'm going to talk to you about now. So Howard, could you go to the next slide? So I wear a lot of hats lately as a developer. So I've been a consultant contractor for a good while, and so I do a lot of different work. So I've talked about work on Domino before, which I'm still doing. I work with other clients, and the main one that I've been talking about lately is kind of a very representative, large project that I do. It's a large suite of NSFs. They were originally classic notes applications. They gained kind of early XPages UIs, and then I was brought on as part of a revamp for that, and it's grown into OSGI plugins with services, and now there's, you know, over a dozen NSFs that go into this and a distribution. So it's kind of like a very large, complicated application, and it's both it spurred me on into a lot of development for the tools I'll be talking to here. So my tool chain has grown fairly complicated, covering this and my other projects, but the core of how I do my work day to day is that I work on a Mac, and I have a notes installation here, and I don't really actually use notes much during my day, but I do use this as essentially the runtime. So it allows me to do some of this compilation of things. And the main thing I look at is Eclipse. So Howard did a great job talking about how to do on-disk projects. And so a lot of my work is looking at both the OSGI plugins, which I believe Serdar will be talking about as well, and also the on-disk project representations of those outside of Designer. So I'll work on some code in plugins and then have that have that reflected in these on-disk projects and work with that in source control. So these are all part of the same repository. It's it has many projects organized with Maven, and all of these things are related. And it's kind of like the after you do your initial setup and then after you work with some OSGI plugins, it's kind of like that. If you leave it to grow in the back of the fridge for a while, you end up with the sort of project that I work on. So like I said, my main environment is the Eclipse IDE. I've been getting quite a bit of use out of a tool that they've been recently adding called Wild Web Developer, which is kind of a fun name for better web tooling. So if you've done like Angular or React development in Visual Studio Code, Wild Web Developer brings some of that kind of newer style tooling to Eclipse and lets you edit JavaScript and HTML in a nicer way than they had previously. And then I also use the XPages SDK. So that is a project that's been on OpenNTF for a good long while. And what it lets you do is the main thing I use, it has a couple capabilities, but the main thing I use is that it lets you run you can work on plugin projects in Eclipse on one machine or in Eclipse outside of Designer, and then point Domino to those plugins in your workspace. And so you'll make a change, you can just restart HTTP and then see your change immediately. So this is as opposed to the full process of build the update site, import it into Domino, then restart HTTP. So it speeds up that process quite a bit. As I mentioned, as I've blogged about very frequently, I also use Maven. So this is, if you're not familiar with it, it's a build tool. So in Eclipse, if you have an NSF or in Designer, if you have an NSF, or in Eclipse, if you have a normal Java project, you'll have a step where it will either build automatically or you'll manually press build. And what it does is it goes through and it says, okay, here are all the Java files, I'll compile these. Here are all the XPages, I'll do what I need to do. Maven is a very common tool in the Java world for organizing projects. So you'll say, okay, here's my core project configuration, and it will know here are all the Java files, here are all the other resources, all JavaScript it needs to do. And so this is a mechanism for doing that in a way that's independent of just Eclipse or just Designer, and it's just done. And this parlays well into something I'll talk about, especially towards the end, which is using automated build tools and having a server build your projects for you. So Maven ties all of this stuff together. I also particularly use a set of Maven plugins called Tycho, which is something that allows you to do OSGI development in a way that mirrors how it works in Eclipse. So all of those dependencies between them. So if you've worked with OSGI development with XPages, you'll know you have to rely on core XPages plugins so you can get to the classes you're familiar with, the JSF, things like that. Tycho allows Maven to work the same way and understand all that kind of thing. I've also, over time, and I've worked on some projects for this, used a tool called OpenLiberty for Java EE and XPages application development. So OpenLiberty is the open source version of WebSphere Liberty, which is unsurprisingly a variant of WebSphere. But I know we were all scarred pretty well by IBM's handling and discussion of Domino and WebSphere for a good long while, where they said, oh, Domino developers just use this, and it was this nightmarish mountain of configuration and code and just impossible to get into. But Liberty is actually, it's very trimmed down, it's very clean, very modern, and it allows me to do very rapid development inside Eclipse. So I'll have a screenshot shortly showing like this is where I have my Liberty server running these applications. And if you followed along on any of my blogging or the projects I put up, I've actually done a tremendous amount of work making it so that I can run XPages applications this way on the Mac outside of Designer, so I can do rapid development there, working on those, changing things around, and getting that to run in a much friendlier environment. Another tool, as I mentioned a little bit, is Visual Studio Code. So periodically I'll work on something that's either entirely separate from Domino or it will be a like a NPM based web project. So again, a React or web component based project that will target Domino, but is not an XPages application, and it's not a Java OSGI application. And for that, Visual Studio Code is, it's probably fair to say it's the best and most common IDE for that sort of JavaScript work. So, even if it's going to eventually run on Domino and consume REST services from it, using Visual Studio Code for React development in particular and that sort of thing is extremely pleasant. It's very up to date. There are tons of tutorials out there, and so even though Eclipse is definitely getting better in this area, VS Code is top notch. And I do every once in a while, I'll dip my toes into mobile development, both for Android and iOS, primarily with a tool called Multi-OS Engine, which lets you do Java development targeting iOS. And for that, I use IntelliJ IDEA. So there was a good couple of years ago, the Android tooling moved over to Android Studio, which is based on IntelliJ, and so that's the tool to do Android development. It's actually gotten a little difficult to do without it. And IntelliJ is a good IDE. It's essentially a direct product competitor to Eclipse. I've gone back and forth on which one I prefer. I've ended up back on Eclipse, but for a lot of Java development, if you talk to a lot of Java developers like Java EE and Spring Boot developers, they'll say they'll vouch for IntelliJ, and it's pleasant. It's nice. It has not yet become my cup of tea, but it is pretty good. And then finally towards the bottom of this is the actual the Windows and Designer installation. So as much as I have worked to get away from Designer and replace it, it is still there, lurking around in the background. And so I have a set of Windows VMs on a machine that's safely secured down in my basement that I can remote desktop into, and that's where I keep Designer. So if I'm working on an XPages thing that's specific to Domino, or creating a new NSF, or just doing like a quick thing where I don't have the full scaffolding of my main projects, I do use Designer. I connect to that, so this would be equivalent to using a VM locally. So I periodically have to do that, and sometimes I still do classic note stuff. And so Designer is there, and much to my chagrin, I do load it up periodically. And then as I'll go into, I use Jenkins. It's a critical part of my infrastructure, and then I'll have a little bit more on this later. So could you move to the next slide? So this is basically what I stare at day in and day out. So it'll be, the projects vary, but this is what my Eclipse environment looks like. So naturally, Designer being based on Eclipse looks kind of like this, but I use the Mac version. I have all my projects in here, and I work with this constantly. I've not been one to customize my Eclipse environment too much, so this is pretty similar to the standard layout. But you'll see there, the handful of things. So, I have my code in the center. I have my nice little syntax coloring that I've been using for years and years. I like my code to look like candy, basically. And so this is how I work. So you'll see on the left, I tend to have projects that are these trees of Maven projects. So as you get familiar with Maven, you'll learn that the way it tends to be organized is hierarchical, where you'll have related modules that deal with each other. So a lot of the times I'll have, here are the OSGI projects, here are the NSF projects, and then here are the combining distribution and update site projects, and they all work together, and they're all organized. And Eclipse does a great job of organizing this stuff and letting you work with these large groups of projects, which is one of the main reasons that I stick with it. You'll also see down on the bottom right the servers view. So Eclipse has long had this notion of embedding Java servers. So you can do Tomcat, and here I do Liberty, where you'll embed the server in Eclipse, and then you can run your projects directly on this. So if you're, if you compare this to Domino with Designer, generally with Designer, you will open an NSF on a server, and then you will work on it, and then you'll, that will just happen on the server. Like, that will be working live against that server. This gives something of a similar experience, where you're running the server locally. You can also point to a remote one, but you tend to be running the server locally, controlled via Eclipse, and it gives you a local runtime. So it's essentially like a very souped up version of Designer's local web preview, which incidentally, if you're still using that for XPages stuff, do not. But in general, like it's that same general concept of this runs the web version of your project as you're working on it. So you can embed these in here. In some of my workspaces, I'll have half a dozen of these for different projects. It really encourages you to create purpose-built ones that are configured for this and say, I want to run this project on here, run this project on there. And this gives me a great experience, especially with a larger project where I'll have lots of dependencies all brought together, and then I can completely skip that process of waiting for Domino to restart or deploying out to a Domino server or syncing with an NSF in Designer and all the fault-prone stuff that comes with that. So I've developed a great workflow of working with this stuff all in Eclipse, and then I can just view it from a browser with my local runtime. And it's using, as I mentioned, I have Notes installed, so it will use my Notes ID to access databases, and so I'll be able to do all of my Notes development this way, well, almost all of it, and then that way, have this very pleasant experience and have this very pleasant environment all contained. Can you move to the next slide? So I've talked about my XPages development experience. So I have, with a lot of care, I've worked on a project called the XPages Runtime, which is, not really a meaningful title on its own, but what this is my project up on GitHub, where what I've done is I've taken the core XPages code and then made it so that it runs on these Java web servers outside of Domino's. And XPages, before it was XPages, originally ran on tools like WebSphere. And all of those capabilities are still there. And because I got so tired of dealing with Designer and Domino, I figured, well, can I run this outside of it again? And the answer is yes. And so my client's main project, I have hammered things locally and in the project into shape where I can actually run this in these multiple servers. And what this means is, I can make massive changes to the plugins, and I can add new dependencies and do all these changes and do all these things that you would do that in Designer or Domino would require, an update on the server, or a lot of the times in Designer you would have to install a new build of the OSGI plugins, your XPages library, in order to see new classes or change methods, and it ends up being like a really onerous experience trying to do that, having to restart these tools, and it, and having to deal with that all the time is difficult. And so I've brought my tooling to a point where I can do most of this outside of Designer, and so I'll have with the NSF ODB tooling, among other things, I have it so that it can do autocomplete for XPages code. So it knows what the components are, it knows what the properties are, it can do some validation, and so this allows me to edit XPages and see them in my local environment without Designer, without Domino. And this has generally improved my life quite a bit. And so now it's at the point where, when I'm working on this massive XPages project, I only very rarely go to Designer. It's been a long process, but it's brought me to the point where it's primarily done with Eclipse with these tools. And I've blogged about this a bit, and I think I'm going to do it some more because it has definitely gotten to the point where it's like, oh, this is a real thing that other people could do rather than just kind of an idle project that I had. Could you move to the next slide? So with my plugin development experience, I've mentioned how a lot of what I work on still does involve OSGI plugins for Domino. So XPages libraries and a lot of JAX-RS REST services. And so this involves deploying things out to Domino. And as much as I've done a lot of work making it so that my little embedded Liberty server is a good representation, it's not the same representation. So eventually I do need to see how things will work on Domino, see if there's trouble specifically with the plugins on there, make sure that everything works with the same path that it's going to be during production. And so this is where I use the XPages SDK. So a couple of years ago, Serdar did some great work making it so that with the XPages SDK, you can run it over the network. So I have, this is useful for virtual machines in general, and in my setup where I have my Eclipse environment where I'm working on these plugins, and then I have a shared folder mapped on my Windows virtual machine that then points back to this. So I can have it load these plugins from Eclipse and just restart Designer or Domino without having to do the reinstallation. So I still get all the benefits of having the nicer operating system and environment there, and then I get this kind of rapid iteration. So that in this case, it's without any of the super fancy stuff. I'm using this XPages SDK, which is a long established project on OpenNTF. I also do a trick that I've blogged about a little while ago, where if you have an update site project in Eclipse, you can build that and then point Designer to that as well. You can say, okay, pull your plugins from here, and then it will be able to pick up your changes more easily. So you can refresh that target platform if you change a method signature or something like that, and Designer will be able to pick up on this. I don't necessarily recommend this because it can get very fiddly, where Designer will be trying to reach over a network drive and it'll be either slow, or it will have unmounted the drive and it'll freak out and freeze up, or it's very fiddly. But it can be a neat little trick where if you do this, it will save you some hassle, where if you add a method to an object in the plugin, you don't then necessarily have to go through the whole process of installing into Designer, restarting it, loading it up, reopening your project, all that. I try to do this full setup less over time. Like I said, I've done a lot of work making it so that I can do a lot of things outside of Designer entirely. But this is closer, kind of like the traditional thing, where eventually, no matter how much of a nice experience I have locally, eventually this stuff will have to go onto Domino and will have to be editable in Designer. So I use this to smooth that process a bit. Could you move to the next slide? So the big thing that I think, aside from all of my I do this stuff for my personal experience, one of the big things that I think is important, and another thing that I believe I'll be writing about more, is the work I've done getting a great CI/CD pipeline. So that stands for continuous integration and continuous either deployment or delivery. In this case, it's more delivery technically, but it generally means the same thing. I mean, people can get picky about it, but what this means is that I have a Jenkins server. It's running on a cloud-hosted virtual machine. And then what happens is it periodically checks with the repositories. You can do this either on a schedule or have it be notified. It checks with my source control repositories, so that when any of us on the team make a commit to Git, so we're all using the same source control and the kind of thing that Howard talked about. Whenever any of us push up a change to the server, Jenkins will see this and then immediately start a build. So it knows how to speak Maven essentially, and then it will say, oh, there was a change to the master branch, there was a change to the current release branch, there was a change to the develop branch, and so it will pick this up and then run through the build. So it will build all of the OSGI plugins for me. It runs some compile time tests, which is another fiddly thing, but that will make sure, if I have some test data, I can have that happen automatically, and then if something breaks, I can get a notification. It will build all the NSFs, and then I use a plugin for Maven called the Maven Assembly plugin at the end. And what that does is it builds a zip file that includes the update sites. So if you've seen any release I've uploaded to OpenNTF lately, it tends to use this, where it'll bring all of it in. You'll have a folder that has the update sites, you'll have a README, you'll have a license, and it also brings in all the built and NSFs. So you'll have an NTF directory with all the NSFs, and then I can hand that off to my client, or more specifically, my client can go to this page and get it himself without me having to, constantly do this build and re-upload it. And then there will just always be a fresh build ready, so that anytime it's time to deploy to production or to staging, my client can just go grab it, apply the NSFs or update the NTFs, and then update the update site, and then there you go. So there was, as I mentioned, there were more than a dozen NSFs in this. And so I used to be in the business of, I would have a Designer installation just dedicated to opening all of these things, syncing the NSFs, and then copying, making a new copy. Say, okay, this is NTF for this day. This is an NTF for this day. This is an NTF for this day. And so now I have this system where this all just happens automatically. So any change, it all just happens. It takes away a lot of the human error that would occur, where I'd be like, oh, I thought I updated that one, but I hadn't. Oh, it's an old version. Oh, Designer didn't pick up this change, and so it doesn't have everything. And so now, not only is it less time, it's also much, much more accurate, because this is just Jenkins and Maven doing it for me. Like, they're always going to get all the changes because they're all there. They're not going to forget to do one of the NSFs. They're not going to accidentally make it, copy it to the wrong location. And then I have it up, copy this to a folder, and then I just have this page. It's actually a Java agent that spits it out, but it's, it could be like an XPage, where it just shows, it reads the contents of that folder, says, here are the latest downloads. If I have a little thing where you click the summary, and then it shows, here are the last, 5 days of commits, so that this will answer the question where my client says, hey, did that change make it in? You can just go and look at the summary and it'll say, these are the changes that made it into this build, like this is what's there. So this is all stuff that happens automatically. I also have these CI servers, as I refer to them here, as these are Liberty instances it'll build up this XPages application, put it out there, and then run that. It's backed by the same Domino test data as the main test server, so that what'll happen is that I will sit here, I will push up and commit, the server will run its build. It tends to take 20 minutes or so, and then it will automatically deploy. And so all I did was make a change locally, commit it, and then all of this stuff happens. And then at the end, my client has a server they can look at with the changes immediately available and a file they can download so that they can deploy that to, hopefully not production right away, but they can deploy to whichever server they want, and I will not ask. And then all of this happens every time, happens automatically. And this whole process is kind of the culmination of the work I've been doing, which is like this way. These are so many problems that are off my plate and done with this. And so a lot of this work I've done is to get to this point of having these servers humming along and doing this work for me. So a lot of the things that you deal with Designer, it's like I can just have computers do that for me. So I think that covers my my general workflow pretty well, like the tools I use. I mean, when I was composing this, I realized that there was a lot I could demonstrate, but I would very easily go even further off into the weeds than I have already. So it's it's a complicated thing, but all these tools do eventually fit together, and I will be talking about them more. So I think I will now hand this off to Serdar.
Thank you, Jesse. And I'll need the screen share access. Yeah. Yes, thank you. I guess you can see.
I see a candle.
Yeah, candles. That's okay.
Yep.
So
we got it, Serdar.
Yeah. Okay. In this last part of today's webinar, it's the toughest part, I guess. After Jesse, after so many advanced stuff, mine will be seen like primitive. So for those who scares a lot from Jesse's slides, I will talk about a little bit easier stuff. I will talk about how I am using Eclipse to develop OSGI plugins targeting Domino environment. And more specifically, of course, before that, I'm Serdar. If you don't know me, I'm an independent developer working on Domino application development. Lately, I have been working a lot on OSGI, RESTful services, integration projects, etc. And plus, I am an half-blooded admin at night. And today, I have been dealing with RESTful services on Domino for some time. One of technologies I have been using is Apache Wing Servlets. Particularly, I'm designing JAX REST services, which are OSGI plugins based on Apache Wing Servlets. I'm not going into details why I am using this methodology, because I have already talked about it a lot of times in different user group organizations. One of them was lately in Engage. It was 6 polite ways to design a RESTful API. So to design a RESTful API, there are various methods in Domino, and I have talked about these methods, their advantages, disadvantages, etc. Specifically on Apache Wing, I had a session a while ago at Icon UK. These are all in my speaker deck account. You can see them. And of course, there are a lot of advantages and disadvantages on OSGI plugins, but it definitely complicates your development environment, as Jesse explained. So My development environment is almost similar to all Java developers on the site, in the community, and I'm using Eclipse IDE for Mac, OpenNTF XPages SDK, and other stuff. Besides Eclipse and Domino stuff, I will point a couple of tools here, especially specific to RESTful service development. One of them is testing tools. There are a couple of testing tools like SOAP UI, etc. Most of people are using Postman, and I use Postman as well. Also included recently POW into my toolchain. It's a little bit practical, more practical than Postman, but both are quite common and useful tools. I'm also using Stoplight Studio for documentation. This is particularly working for generating Open API specs. If you don't know it, and if you are dealing with RESTful APIs, it's a great way to document your API in general, and it's very common these days. Of course, for source control, SourceTree and BitBucket, sometimes GitHub. I recently started to use more OpenNTF Domino API in my project. It's a civilized way to use Java for Domino. I also have my own project, XLogback, also contributed to OpenNTF for logging in my Java applications. Of course, in this session, we will focus on Eclipse and XPages SDK and see how to configure them properly. And I'm using Eclipse for Mac, like Jesse. And this was quite a trouble for me at the start, as I'll tell you why in a moment. But using the native app in my Mac and liberating from Windows on my Mac has been a much better move for myself for various reasons. Like, you can use all keyboard shortcuts. It's more stable. It's more embedded. It's more compatible to the Mac user experience. Eclipse, which version is always an issue, and because Designer and Domino server has not been updated for some time, so we are a little bit reluctant to upgrade our Eclipse version. Neon is quite old because I'm lazy. I'm too lazy not to upgrade it, but I know many people around are trying to use more recent versions of Eclipse. I don't know if there's a huge issue with that. Also, XPages SDK, it started as a combination of different small projects from IBM, and I think Nathan Freeman has combined these many tools and provided a single product. And later, a couple of years ago, I made some contributions for especially VM support. Jesse added some new features, and it becomes a vital part of my environment, and it makes my job a lot easier. And Eclipse, as I said, provides much better experience for a Java developer, especially by adding great capabilities. It's of course, it provides a better version. It provides better tooling, more integrated to many other systems. But it comes with a price. It needs to be configured. And for efficient development, we need to configure it well. And when I started plugin development, I found my way in the dark. I had no idea how OSGI works, but of course, that's a difficult way to learn OSGI in a complete OSGI development environment. But long story short, among other many possibilities, I improvised a way in time. I'm pretty sure there are much better ways to do what I do now, but eventually you'll find a way with a little more trial and error. The one thing missing in my experience was there wasn't a lot resources, so that's why we are here now to share our story and share our best practices. So when we use Eclipse IDE to develop those plugins, we have basically three objectives. First, we need to be able to compile our projects successfully, which means Eclipse needs to access what it needs. You know, in classical Java, we put those libraries in our class path, but in the plugin world, things are a little bit different. Second, we can run plugins on a test server quickly. Many people are using test servers, mostly local. If you are using Mac, you don't have any chance to use a local server. We are using our VMs. So this run on server is happening without transferring files or dealing with packages. It's instant. Eclipse and OSGI have standard mechanisms for that. We just need to utilize those. I'll explain in a moment. But this run on server thing is not practical all the time. And each time you change your code, you need to restart the HTTP task. Therefore, I often need a quicker way to test simple routines. So I want to be able to run my code on local with a just, I don't know, keyboard shortcut. And I'll talk about that later. But overall, we only need a few things. We need a JVM to use. JVM will access to the classes needed, and this is called a target platform in the plugin world. To run things on server, there needs to be two-way file access between server and Eclipse, and also a local node setup will enable us to run our classes locally, even works with Mac nodes, as I found recently, as I learned recently, let's say. So the target platform is the key, and it's some form of class path if you map to the classical Java development to the plugin world. All Java artifacts we need to access are normally part of our Domino server installation or whatever you target. It might be any Java server. We need to access them in the compile time as well. So the target platform definition is the location of those artifacts. So we are basically telling Eclipse that you can find those plugins in these such and such directories, etc. So when we start using Eclipse, this is the first thing we should do, and we need to tell Eclipse where to find these plugins. But there is also an annoying jar file we need. This is because of an ugly fact we learned with an effort. Domino resources can only be accessed via C API, and when we use Java, in fact, on the background, there is a native interface we are using, and this native interface is platform dependent, unfortunately. There is a jar file provided by IBM and HCL, of course, now. It contains the definition for the Domino class structure for different scenarios, different access scenarios. And we need to be able to access the nodes jar file during the compile time, and it's enough for now. But it's an old jar file. There might be some problems to embed that in your development environment. Practically, we can create a plugin that contains nodes jar file, or we can add it to JVM. however it suits you. I'm following the JVM method or GRE method, and it doesn't matter a lot. So the second thing we want to achieve is to run our plugin on server. So Domino provides an OSGI platform, and OSGI platforms have usually have a plugin repository to launch plugins on startup. And in production or in a normal server, the OSGI platform uses its pre-configured repositories on its file system, as well as update site databases to load its plugins into memory. If you ever installed, I don't know, extended extension library or some form of other project into Domino server, you would know update site databases. You have created update site databases once in your lifetime. Obviously, this is not practical for development environments. I mean, imagine every time you make a change, you need to pack your plugins into an update site and upload them to the server, which is impractical. Instead, Domino SGI can be configured to use a custom file-based repository just for temporary purposes in your development environment, of course. All we need is to list which plugins to be used name by name and write them into a file named pda launch ini and place that file into your Domino somewhere in your Domino folder. And here comes the XPages SDK plugin, and it can magically create it can magically create this file. Create this file in the Domino server, pointing back to your Eclipse environment or whatever, all plugins needed using defined target platform and selected projects, of course. Once the SDK configures your environment, all you have to do is to restart the HTTP task and your changes will be taken by the server. It's easy. In classical scenario, this whole setup is straightforward because you are probably using Eclipse and a local Domino server on the same Windows box, and they can see each other on the file system, no problem. XPages SDK needs to know everything is in position, and it will help you create JVM settings. It will help you create your target platform, etc. And since the target platform is on the same computer, Eclipse workspace is on the same computer, Eclipse will see the Domino server, Domino server will see the Eclipse, everything is fine. However, if you are like me, you may need to get down to the nuts and bolts. Since my Eclipse is on my macOS and my Domino server is on VM, virtual machine, which might be a Windows or Linux, another form of complication, I need to be able to access its file system, obviously, and vice versa. It will Domino server needs to access my file server as well. Generally, in virtual machines, they have no issue sharing files with the host computer and VM, between host computer and VM, but in Linux, you may need to do it manually. In such a setting, it would be dependency to point your target platform to your virtual machine. So think about it. When you compile your code, it needs to see the target platform, and if you point Eclipse to the VM folder, it will want to see it every time. Instead, I create a local repository for target platform, add whatever I need to add into that target platform. It's an extra work, but because, you know, when I upgrade the target server, I need to change my target platform plugins as well. But it's practical on some level, as I said. I can compile my code even the remote VM is not running. A couple of years ago, as I said, I added the support to the XPages SDK project, so it can handle mappings, file name mappings between VM and the host computer for these plugin mappings. Last capability we want to add is the ability to run Java code locally with just a keyboard shortcut, for instance. And of course, this is much more practical in real life. Normally, if you are developing a REST API like me, each time you make a change, you go to the Domino server, restart your HTTP, go to your testing application, if it's browser or Postman or POV, whatever it is, you run a test, and that's annoying in normal life. And what I do is basically I keep the implementation of the REST API and of my business logic, for instance, separate, and that's not rocket science. And I create Java routines to test. For instance, let's take an example. I have a routine business logic that search some database, get a result, transform it back, and display to the user. And I should be able to test my business logic without a web server. And I create a small Java code testing my functionality. I only run that small Java code on my Eclipse. And of course, the same idea applies for unit testing as well. So you can write your unit testing for your API as a good developer. Of course, we write Java at the end, and Eclipse as a normal IDE should be able to run Java code. That shouldn't be a problem. But the thing is, you will need some sort of configuration because of Domino. Of course, Domino is using some native libraries on the run, and those native libraries should be accessed by Eclipse on the runtime, and it's tricky, especially on Eclipse for Mac. For instance, I found that run configuration might be customized for this. This is because, as I told you, Node's jar file contains class names and class structures. It only contains the interface, not the implementation. And the implementation is in a DLL file or SO file, depending on your environment. And that's why Eclipse needs to find the way to access those system files at the runtime. This is an ugly solution, but it works. As I said before, I found my way among very different combinations. Once you configure to run your config correctly, you may even use OpenNTF Domino API on your local runs. And lately, I even stopped writing those script agents for one-time operations, like big chunk of exports, imports, etc. And I started to write small Java agents to do such time-consuming stuff. And in my plugin environment, my plugins has also some routines, frequently used routines in different projects. I can reuse those projects in my small, let's say, agents. Of course, these all stuff are about my development life cycle. And when it comes to deployment, I use the old style deployment with update site replication, which is not ideal, but in my level of frequency, let's say, it becomes ideal in time. Of course, there are ways to automate this workflow by Ant scripts, Maven, combined by CI/CD techniques. Jesse already provided some examples just a minute ago. And it depends on the level of complexity you need. Of course, there's a learning curve, and you need time and effort to transform yourself, your projects, and it didn't justify for my cases if you are new buys. But if you are new buys, I mean, it makes sense. It makes sense to start with a modern approach at the first place. For instance, you don't actually create your target platforms from the scratch. P2 repositories are there for a reason. But of course, you need to transform your environment once, and it's a little bit work. A couple of challenges finally are waiting for us. For instance, as I said, using Eclipse for Mac was a challenge for me because one reason Notes for Mac is different, particularly some versions were using different versions of plugin locations, contents might be different from time to time, and even the end of line differences needs to be considered when you differentiate your environment from, I don't know, Windows to Mac. So SourceTree thought all my files have been changed because of these end of line marks. And Domino upgrades, of course, in time become a thing. For example, I need to update my target platform settings even in minor fixbacks in Domino. And my top tip here is probably to document everything on your setup, which target platforms are included, which settings are used in JVM, run configuration, etc. You can export those settings from Eclipse. Because from time to time things get broken, and it will be quite handy to have a known good configuration on your notebook or somewhere in your computer. That brings the end of my part, and if you have any questions, you can ask now or raise your questions on Slack channels. We are all following OpenNTF Slack channels as well as XPages Slack channel, and I'm handing it to Graham, I guess.
Beautiful, thank you. Thank you to all three of you. Okay, we've got about 7 minutes left to the bottom of the hour, so we'll try and get through as many of these questions as we've got. Thank you to everyone for putting in your questions, and again, you're welcome to jot them in here. We'll try and get to them quickly, and if not, as Sardar says, certainly in Slack would be a great thing. So the first one was during Howard's presentation, and it just asked for pointing out some of the advantages of Git over SVN. Maybe I'll throw that out to all three of you.
Yeah, so I have never used SVN, so I couldn't even begin to answer.
Maybe Jesse or Sardar?
I used it a good while ago. I mean, my view on it is it's the sort of thing where if it's working for you, it works for you. You know, if you're an SVN organization, you know, I don't think that there's any compelling reason for you to change. I do feel that like Git has some nice advantages in its general model, but really I'd say the biggest advantage that it has if you have not picked one yet, or if you're in the market for a new source control system, is that it's the most common one and it's good. So that gives you a lot of advantage as far as like looking for tutorials and for help and asking questions. And SVN certainly has its followers. It's been around for a good long time, so it's not like you'd be out at sea. But again, if it works for you, great. If you're in the market for a new one, I'd go with Git just out of popularity because it's also good.
I'd suggest that any of those new kids coming out of school are going to be much more familiar with Git versus SVN. Okay, moving along. So there was just a comment about using Team Studio for version control. And of course, yes, Team Studio has a good full set of tools that lots of people have been using for many years. Of course, it's a paid tool, but you can do version control using Team Studio as well. Next question was about Swiper. Is Swiper compatible with Designer 10 and 11?
I believe it is. I know I have used it on 11, but primarily I'm still working in Designer 10. But when I used it on 11, I didn't see any issues, so it seemed to install and work. Jesse,
okay.
have you used that?
Yeah, as far as I know, it works fine. I forget if there was some version where it needed an update, but the latest version, I mean, I use, so as far to my knowledge, it works just fine.
Cool.
I think there were some problems in some versions of 901 FP 9 and 10. I guess so. I had some issues. I had asked to Cameron about that. I think Cameron has the recent information, and we were expecting a big improvement on the designer side after version 10, I guess, right?
I think they were talking about possibly doing some significant enhancements, but I guess that kind of it's been put off to a future version. But,
well, sorry, Howard, there's an additional question or a comment here about would have been nice to see Swiper in action. So maybe we should bring that back as a future webinar topic, or even doing a video.
Well, there's actually
Cameron.
there's not much to see. You saw it in action. It basically it just kind of filters out the design elements that really didn't have changes. It doesn't really, I know there's also a question on formatting. As far as I know, it doesn't do anything to the formatting of the files themselves. It's just going to look and say and not sync from the NSF to the ODP changes that really don't matter.
Yeah, they're in the
metadata files and stuff like that.
Yep. There's actually another comment here about Swiper. So in the past couple of years when trying Swiper, I've had problems with Swiper changing DXL as it reformats the XML so that it breaks the layout with added spaces. Anybody had any experience with these issues? And if possible, do we know of a solution? Sounds like that's one we want to bring back to Cameron too.
Yeah, I personally have not, but I get conceptually what will be going on there because Swiper does it essentially pretty prints the XML by default. The DXL that comes out will be all left aligned and not very well formatted, but Swiper will change that, and there is a little bit room for spaces then starting to matter. If you are running into that, using binary DXL should avoid that, because if your pages and forms, which are the ones that I believe would be most affected, if they are represented as that base 64 version of the binary data, then all of that space, like the spacing of the XML, will no longer matter.
Cool. Jesse, there was a question specifically for you around Open Liberty and specifically asking, is it possible to run an XPages application inside of Open Liberty?
Yup. I do it all day. It's not necessarily a perfect representation because it is a different environment. Like in my client's project, I did have to do work to have it so that it would pick up different things. Like, you know, there's a lot of the code is identical, but there are certain things about how it expects, like what the login URLs are and a handful of other things. Like I have to provide implicit session and database context that Domino does for you. So, you know, it does take in-depth knowledge of how the XPages stack works and how and what you have in Liberty versus on Domino, but you know, the final answer is yes. I do that all the time.
Cool. We've got two more here. This one's about source control. So with regard to the source control and on-disk projects, the help file used to say that using text-based DXL doesn't guarantee a full round-trip fidelity. I think this is going back to what we were talking about before. However, it never said what would be lost. Have we got any experience with what that means? Are there any design elements that should not be imported from source control if we're using text-based DXL?
Well, I'm going to take a guess, and I would say that maybe if you have some of the older type of notes client things like layout regions, that perhaps that might be something where that might not be best to do the text-based DXL. As Jesse mentioned, you might want to then use the binary DXL. And choose that option for that particular NSF. But I'm not really sure exactly what would be lost or what would be affected. But I would imagine that would be something like the layout regions, which is very probably basically you're designing a, if you remember what the layout regions were, that was kind of like a graphics editor that you could lay out, you know, your form or the layout region. So I bet that probably is something that would not necessarily translate well to text.
All right. Okay, and we've got time for our very last question, which is a fun one. How can we find the color setup in Eclipse like what Jesse put together? And I'll go further and say Domino Designer because I know you can do it in Domino Designer as well.
Yeah, so
it's the same, yeah. There's a plugin for that.
Yeah, so it's a color scheme called Plastic Code Wrap Notepad++, which is it's a design that's been around for a while. I believe the plugin is Eclipse Color Themes. It's actually kind of old and getting a little rickety at this point, but should still work. It should also still work in Designer. I used to install it in there, so I think it's on the Eclipse Marketplace, or if you search around. So I believe it's just called Eclipse Color Theme. Unfortunately, that's such a generic name that you'll run across plugins that are changing the theme of Eclipse, the outside of it, or other way talking about like dark mode themes and things like that. But that is the name of the plugin. I don't know if this color scheme is still available, but I could post it somewhere. It's just an XML file I have that I keep in Dropbox, so I could post that around somewhere.
Yeah, I think it's still available. Very interesting. It's not used to. It's only used to install a new skin. For instance, lately I have upgraded my Eclipse to another version, and this plugin is lost, but my editor screen is still in a different color. But I can change the color, of course. But I remember it works because I have installed recently on my Eclipse client on Windows.
It'd be worth a quick blog post. Okay, we are 1 minute over, so I am going to wrap this thing up. As you can see on screen, we have our next webinar scheduled for September 17th, and we are very happy to announce that we've got John Curtis from HCL, who is going to discuss all of the really cool and fun latest things that he's working on in Domino query language. So be sure to sign up for that, and there's the link in the slides. I also wanted to just invite folks that have been a part of this and sort of seen what we were talking about. As much as the subject matter kind of goes off in whatever direction, you're kind of free to talk about whatever you like. And so we'd like to invite the community to come and maybe share a little tidbit about something that they have in their development environment that they find unique and helpful and saves time. Or whatever. By all means, this is not a webinar series that should just be folks that are from OpenNTF speaking. We want to open it up to the community and get contributions from everyone. So please do reach out to us if you've got something that you'd like to share. You certainly don't have to talk for 20 minutes. If it's a quick 5-minute tip, that would be fabulous. We'd love to share it with the community. So with that, I'll say thank you to Howard, Jesse, and Sardar for their presentations today. And thank you all for attending. And we will see you next time.
Thanks, Graham.
Thank you, Graham.
Thank you.